Let's try this again. Yes, that's much better. So apologies for that. That's what happens when troubleshooting a few things around OBS and mixing inputs. It looks like OBS didn't pick up my changes. So good day, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this weekly live stream. This is all about looking at the Uno platform and developing on the Uno platform, adding features and explaining what's happening with recent updates. And if you have any questions, just let me know in the chat, or later on if you have other questions and watching this after with the recordings, let me know on Twitter. So today we're going to be looking at a few things with regards to what happens with the source generation from XAML to C#. And there are actually two issues that we're going to troubleshoot. So there's one that is called the default bind mode in XAML. So the default bind mode feature is really about changing the default mode for xbind. And what happens is that when you're defining multiple xbind elements inside of your XAML. So let's take one example here. When you're defining an xbind, by default, that xbind is set to be only one time. So that means I'm getting stuck on this very often. And the idea is that if you set that xbind and you set that to, let's say, a view model or directly on the dependency property or something like that, then the property won't update. So there's a way to change that. And the good idea, the idea here is that you can set the xDefaultBindMode one way to set, let's say at the top of your document, let's say on the page, for instance, and all the xbinds that are defined inside of that page are going to be using the default mode that you set. The problem here in this issue is that when default bind mode is set at the top of the page, if there's a data template that's defined as a resource, then the default bind mode is not going to be taken into account. So it's going to have to be set internally. It's going to have to be set at each level, especially on the data template. So we're going to take a look at how to change this. So this is the Uno solution. So I've cloned that solution and I'm going to be opening this. So as for every time that I'm opening that solution, there's a need to be changing the cross-targeting override props file so that you can find here. So when you take that cross-targeting property override sample here, and you make a copy of that file next to it, and then you can change a few things in there. So the property that we want to change is the Uno target framework override, and we're going to be setting it to the unit tests filter. So we're using a filter. We're using a feature from Visual Studio that's called solution filters. The solution filters are available here, and filters are available per workload. So let's say if you're doing .NET 5 development or .NET Standard 2 development for WebAssembly or Mono or anything like that, then you can use a filter specifically for that, and so the Visual Studio is going to be able to open that without crashing. So one of the good thing for this is the newer version that was announced by Microsoft is going to be 64 bits, and so I think it's going to be I think it's called Visual Studio 2022. So that version is going to be 64 bits, and that's going to help a lot. So if you open the solution here, it's likely that Visual Studio is going to crash on you. So don't open that solution directly. It's going to be just a nightmare to work with. So just set the target framework override here, and then you open the solution filter that's needed. So that's what's happening here. So I'm going to be opening just the unit test solution. So what you can see here that only 14 of the 87 projects are opened here, and it's only used to build the UI tests in that position. So for the issue that we're looking at, I remember a while back that I implemented that feature, the notion of having the default bind mode set to something. So we're going to actually go try to find in the tests where there's a test that actually validates this. And it's probably not the right one because it's probably doing something else. So we're going to take a look in the current project. And I don't know, we probably have to select one file. And let's find a test that does that. Okay, so there's a test, and that test is here. So what that one does, let's take a look. Okay, so that file is valid, is showing a few things. It's showing, so don't mind the squigglies, it's the Net Standard 2 project that's not understanding what we're showing here. And what we have here is a stack panel. So we don't have any binding mode set at the top. So in here we don't have any, so it's undefined. And here we have a one-way, and here we have a two-way. So what that test is not showing is that if we set a bind mode inside of a data template, then it will not validate the right behavior, that it's the right behavior. So what we're going to do is make an additional test. So in the test that we're seeing here, if we are going to take a look at that one, there's probably an additional X bind here. So we have next bind here that validates the default mode undefined. So we assert a few things, and then we force the load, and then we check that if we update the properties that it updates properly. So I'm gonna clone that file and make a second one that is just validating pretty close to the same thing, but using data templates. So we're just gonna validate that we have the incorrect behavior to start with. So we're going to call this data templates. Same thing for the other one. So the important thing here is to make a test that validates that the behavior is not the right one to start with, and then we adjust the code generation afterwards. So in here, so the files is available here, and we're going to change all the names in there. So we have to change the name at the top. There's probably no need to change it inside, and then we're going to change it here as well. And then we're going to take pretty much the same thing. So it's a lot of properties that are defined so that we can validate all that. But we're going to change this, and we're going to put that inside of a data template. So to do this, we're going to do page.resources in the data template that's going to be named my template, and we're going to put the whole grid inside. Okay, and then we need to actually display all this. So actually, that's something that's of interest. So the thing is that the default here is actually the one we want to test from the top. So that test is actually validating lots of things, but not the one that we want to. So that would be, I don't know if we validated the fact that we can set it multiple ways. So let's see. Oh, there's overrides. Okay, there are overrides. So if we set it here and then here again, it is actually changed twice. Okay. So that's something that we need to validate. So we're going to put something at the top. Let's say just one of the modes that we want to have. So the undefined is going to be one way. And actually not sure if we want to keep the other one. Well, let's keep it. It's going to be additional validation. So the idea is that we need to have that block that should be having one-way bindings instead of one-time bindings. That's what is supposed to happen here, but through the data template. So that's it. So now we can validate if that. So we need to display that. So let's do this. So to display it, you need to go to make a content template for content control. You're gonna make a content control for which the content template is going to be just the resource that we put at the top. And we're just going to put some content here so that it displays properly. There we go. Okay. So that should be it. So let's see. So the first thing is to ensure that it builds properly. So if it builds properly, we're going to get all the names and all of that so that we can go into and get the content. So one of the things that people are asking very often is what does that do? And the idea for this is that it alters the way the X name is defined in code behind. So the reason we're using it here, or maybe not in that specific template, but the reason we're using it here is that we want to be able to access the X name that's defined here from the unit test. So otherwise it's a private member and you can't read it. So that's one of the things. So the reason it will not be working in that specific sample is that because we're inside of a data template, xname doesn't do anything because you can't access that element from the code behind. So let's say if you were to have multiple data template instances of that same thing, which of the member in the code behind would you get? That is not clear, so that's what happens. So when you define an xname here, the only thing that you can do is actually do element name bindings or xbind bindings onto an xname, but you can't get it from the code behind. That's the idea behind using the field modifier here. And I think we're falling into the issue that one of the issues that I've been battling against with Visual Studio recently, which is that the build doesn't start because of some unknown reason. So let's see if I can fix that somehow. So on the last thing that I've tried to, it's probably because of the preview. So I could probably try the preview to see if that changes something. So that's not the preview. So let's go take a look at the preview. Maybe it will help. So you just, for that issue, if you try to build, you just rebuild, and it won't do anything. It's actually quite annoying. If you have that issue, there's I probably paste the link for that. But if you have it, just upvote it, that issue, because it's extremely annoying. So let's see. I'm gonna try to see again if that helps. If it does not, then we'll do something else. Okay. So let's see if rebuilding does something. So the rebuild is not saying anything yet. Oh. I wish there was a way to undo modifications to the UI. Okay, so it builds. That's good. Okay, so I mean, if you're moving that window and it just undocks and changes all your layout, maybe that would be of interest if you were to be able to just undo the layout change. Maybe that exists, but I don't know. I haven't seen that. I haven't seen you undo in the window layout. Well, that would be interesting to get. So that's the build. So while everything is building, We're going to go and take a look at what happens when we're building the code here. So what we're trying to fix is the code generation. So it's not there yet, but we're going to take a look at the generators. So in the generation, we have the XAML generator here, and there's a file that's here. It's called the XAML file parser. The file generator, sorry, it's not the same one. And we're going to take a look at if we can find the default bind mode. So default bind mode is defined here. We got a few things that we can do for, so this is the stacking of the bind mode. The default one is the one time. And when we're setting a default bind mode, we're getting a default a new binding mode here. So what may happen is that for some reason the bind mode that's stacked when moving into, so each node in the tree may have a new default bind mode set. So that's why we're stacking them so we get the right ones. What may happen here is that for some reason when we're in a data template, the default bind mode is not the right one. So maybe it's reset. That could be the case. I don't see anything that that changes the bind mode back to its previous values. So it may be something that is different there. Okay, so that Windows long path support is there because of the source generation. It's something that the Rossley team has been having issues as well with, especially when you have generated files that have very long lines that may break. So that's something that that needs to be adjusted there. So it's not happening here because I have a very small path to store the content. But okay, so there's no X data type in the enclosing data template. So that's true. I haven't set that. So when you're defining X binds inside of a data template, you need to set which data type it needs to be used. So in here, the data type is going to be itself. And I'm going to be setting, if we set that one right away, that should be enough. Okay, so let's do this again. That should be enough. So the way the binding mode is handled there is we get the default bind mode, and we set, that's a bit too large. We set the bind mode directly by in the generated code by getting the default bind mode that was available. So that would mean that for some reason we're resetting the stack, and we're gonna have to find out why this happens at that location. So we're gonna be adding some additional code that validates that. There it is. So next thing is, so on the similar features, so there's I chose to group all those issues in the same one, is that there's also an XUID issue in the code generation. So if you're doing something like this with radio buttons and radio button, if you set XUID here inside, the generation fails, and the actual generated code is somewhere around here. And in there's probably something that we're not setting right. So we're probably calling set XUID on the object incorrectly, either because we're not using the right method or the right marker or something like that. So we're going to take a look at that one as well once the other is fixed. Okay, so we're at the tests. There we go. So one failed. Okay, so my template does not exist. So we can see that I wrote my template and the template name is not the right one. So we're probably gonna have to change that. So it's not xname, it's xkey in that context, because it behaves differently if it's named differently. Okay, so that should be good for now. So we can probably go take a look at the generated code and see what happens there. So when we're setting the default bind mode, there's actually nothing that happens to be generated for that specifically. The only thing that happens is that when the parser finds an xbind, it's going to try to find the outer context for the default bind mode. So we can see here the default bind mode is set to one way here. It actually sets that value here. So if there's a binding that's set somewhere in there, let's go find one below. So we got a property set binding here. So we got a set binding here, and that set binding to do a property, we can see here that it sets the binding to one time. So that's the default one because we're at the location in the file that sets the binding to one time. And we can see here that it's already incorrect because we're in default undefined, and default undefined is defined here, and because we've defined one way here, it should flow through to get here and have the implicit one way defined here, but that's not the case that we can see here that it's set to one time. So that's the issue at hand that we're trying to fix. So one thing that we can try now is actually fail a UI test, a unit test. So we're gonna be adding that test. So it's pretty much the same thing as this one. So except that we have to do a few additional things to get the value there. So we're gonna make that one undefined. So all those are the same with the nesting here. Just gonna duplicate the first one for now. And it's undefined. We're going to put it at the end here for lookup's going to be easier. Data template. And in there, so those property won't exist because on that control it's not existing because it's inside of the data template. So we're going to have to go and find those properties differently. So let's go find, so we have to go find those by name. So we're going to be checking for the first one. So SUT, so that property is actually the one that's defined directly on the object itself, but we're going to be setting the data context to itself so that it gets the proper values. Or we're going to move it to another class if it's not problematic. So what we can do is to ensure that the data context is actually the right one. We're going to be setting the data context to itself. So that means that the properties that are defined here can now be data bound through the data context that is going to be set through the content control that's defined here. So it's going to flow through, and then the binding here is going to be set properly. So what we need to do now is, so that's the default values for the multiple ways for bindings. And then we need to validate that the properties are actually at their, so we're setting the values here, and then we assume that by updating those, the text is going to be set properly. So especially for the undefined one, because the others are going to be behaving properly. Those are set explicitly to one way and two way, but it has to be working for that one. So that's what we're going to try to find out. Another thing that we need to change is ensure that we're going to get the right values. So one other thing that's important with bindings is that when you set something before the loaded, the values that you're setting from the source of the bindings is going to be applied immediately. But if you're changing the one way after the loaded happened, then the values won't be updated. So that's why we see here that we're setting the first property to updated one, and then we're changing the binding that should be set here, but it's not getting updated, so it stays to the same value. So what we're going to be having, if that works properly, is that here we're going to get updated 4, because that undefined property is actually going to be inheriting two-way if it were one way. if it works properly. So let's do this. Especially for the two-way one, where reverting back has to do something like that. Okay, so default undefined and undefined one-way, two-way, and others cannot be used explicitly. So we have to go and do find names instead. So let's do multiple values there. So it's going to be called like this, and we can do a find name to find the elements there. So it's default undefined, and then we're going to do the same thing for the others. So I'm not sure if it's going to work right away, and we may have to do the force loaded. So that one may not be valid right away. So we're going to be adjusting that. So we're going to test during at runtime to see if that behaves properly, but that's probably going to be something that we're going to need. So that's default undefined one way. And default undefined two-way. Okay, so what may happen, so this is null, we're setting the value here, so we need to change all those. So there's going to be default undefined, same thing for those. There. So those are objects, but they're not supposed to be objects. And the properties that we have here are text blocks. So we're going to be changing that to text blocks. Same thing for the others. And we're going to try to run that test and see what kind of results we're getting. So it has to fail. If it does not fail, we're gonna it's gonna be a problem. So for that one, okay, so it found the tests. So I'm zooming in for you guys to be able to see everything here, but for me it's pretty small, so I have to do some adjustments for the content. Okay, so there are build errors, probably missed a few things. Define property. So I changed a bit too much. So that one was actually SUT. Let's do that again. So we can see here that the generation does lots of stuff. So it takes all the tests that have been defined here and generates the C# from the XAML. That's why it looks that way. So you can see all the the references to the source. You can see some properties if it needs be, and a few other things like handling bindings and things like that. So that code is not particularly nice to read, but it's not made to be read that much. It's supposed to be fast, and so that's it. Okay, so if we go back to the test itself, it failed, and did it fail for the right reason? Okay, so we can see here that we force loaded the content, and the text here is set to nothing. So is it the right thing? I'm not sure if it's the right thing. It should have been set to something else. Let's go find out if the other values are set properly. May not be the case. So let's do a debug for that one. Okay, so there's an exception here. It's not the right thing. So let's go and debug that. It probably copied a bit too much without changing properties. So it's probably related to those, because the define properties here and then the type here is not the right one. So we're going to be changing this to be the right type. Otherwise, properties are behaving completely incorrectly. Okay, Let's try again. So in Uno, we're making validations that the type of that you're putting here is actually the right one. So if you're registering a property in a type, you're defining something in a type and you're setting the owner to another type, then all sorts of weird things are happening because you're defining a property on one type and then using it on another. And that's the kind of validations that we're making so that it doesn't behave incorrectly. Okay, so this is empty. This is null, which is not good. Why is it that way? That's quite interesting. So default undefined is giving us something, but that one is giving us null. Okay. So why is that? Default undefined one way. Ah, I put it, it's not the right casing. There you go. So that one of the good thing is that there's a edit and continue available here. So sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. So it looks like for this one, it did not. Edits were made that cannot be fixed. So probably I did something wrong here. I don't know what that did. Probably in the XAML. So let's do it again. So this one takes a bit more time. That's interesting. Okay. So we have nothing here, nothing, nothing. Okay, so that's not good. So it's probably, we probably need something different. And I'm wondering if it's not because, so the template has been applied, but there's nothing defined here. So it's supposed to be happening because the data template is the right one. Oh, I understand. So the reason it's not working is that in here, I set the content to hello, which doesn't have all the properties that are there. So I'm just going to set a binding here. Let's try again. So this time I'm going to get the proper data context. Oh, and it's not going to work because the file hasn't changed. So the thing that need to be added there. So if you modify some XAML files inside of the unit tests, we're probably going to be adding that then. It's going to make it easier to work with. So there's one small thing that can be made to do that, because I changed that XAML file, but it didn't rebuild. So there's something that we can change in there. Cycle already added. Okay, so that's what I was that's what I was expecting to fail, because the content is itself, no, it doesn't work. So let's move all the files, all the properties to something else. So what happens here is that we set the SUT to data context, but because SUT is a UI element, then sending it to itself makes it as the content of itself, so it doesn't work. So we're going to move all the properties that are in the control itself to another class that is defined a bit below. Actually, let's do it that way. I'm going to make a class. We're going to call it model. Works. And then it is a dependency object. And we're going to set the data context to that class instead of itself. It's going to be easier, and we need to change all the type ofs here to be that type and not the other one. So let's change that one to be data template model. Okay. And then in the test, instead of setting it to the control itself, we're going to set it to the data context that we want to be manipulated. But in there, that one is not right, so we're going to be changing that to be model instead. And move all the SUTs to be using the model instead of this. So it's this. Same here. And same here. Okay. So what I did, so we're gonna take a look at that one, what it builds. So in the project file, to make sure that XAML files are actually taken into account when doing that, there's a update something that is not there, so we can find that one out on the UNO sources. It's something that we're putting in by default inside of the solution template for WebAssembly, if I remember correctly, so that it picks up the changes that you're making inside of XAML files. So it's that one here, up-to-date check input. So that's something the Visual Studio is looking up for, and is getting all those files and says that if one of those files that are picked up by the globbing here, the build is considered invalid, and then tries to rebuild even if no source files have changed. So it looks like I've made something that's not right. That's something that we may have to look at in some future update, because there's way too much that's spitted out. Unable to find member on property on type. Yes, so that's the case as well. So in here it says that that property is not available in data template, and there's a good reason for that as well, because we changed the type here, so it has to be model now. And now I just changed that file, and I'm going to be adding what I was talking about. So the item group here, so the up-to-date check input, and we're going to be looking for files in that in here. So in there, but we're going to have to exclude a few things. We're going to be excluding bin and obj folders as well. So the same thing, we need to do that, because sometimes the files are copied to the output, so it doesn't work properly. So we're going to exclude those, because we don't want the build to just refresh itself because there's a XAML file in the bin or obj folder that changed. So there's that. Let's go back here. So that's it for the tests. So once we're there, we're going to have to go and debug what's happening inside of the source generators. So missing partial modification. So that's for sure. Again, I need to add a partial. So when you have a dependency object defined here, you need to set the partial modifier here, because the source generator in the code behind, in the source generator behind the scenes is generating another class that's named the same way with a partial modifier. So you have to set it in your code. And then we're going to take a look at how we can debug the source generator to try to find out what's happening there. So the problem with generation that way is that you have so many files that are compiled as part of your application, so it can be a bit difficult to get to. So we're going to be doing some additional findings there to understand what's happening there. And in general, what I do is I add comments inside of the generated file to understand what's happening. So to determine where the generator went through for that file specifically, because there are too many files. Okay, so the test ran, I think, and it failed again this time. And it said Nothing again. So let's see if that's exactly what we were looking for. It may be. Okay, define update 2, update 3. Okay, so it's not set there, but it looks like the fact that we set the data context here, it probably picked up the modifications before we set it on those 3 lines. So what we can do is probably move that here and try to understand that, you know, the default mode is actually taken into account properly. So let's go back up here and let's run the test again and see. No, it doesn't work, interestingly. So let's do it again. And we're going to add a few additional modifications to the source generator to understand where the mode is, how it's set by default. I mean, it's supposed to be set at a certain type at the top. Maybe it's not set properly. So we can see here that at the top level of the file, the default bind mode is set to one way, which is the right thing. But for some reason, it's being reverted back to something else when we're doing this. So in here, I run the test again. Okay, so we moved properly. So we first loaded, set the context. So the first value was captured properly. So that's undefined 1. So it's set automatically and the first, so that's a one-time binding that is setting the proper value. But once we've set that one, we can see here that based on the failure of the test, that we have an actual of undefined 1, which is actually we don't have undefined 1, we have something else. We should be having 4 here, but we still have the 1 that was set before. So with the binding mode that's set to one way, it should have been picked up, and it's not the case. Okay, so we have a test now, so let's try to figure out what happens and why the binding is not set properly. So if I take a look at the generated code again, so is it the right one? Yes, data template. Okay, so we're trying to take a look at that one that's defined here. So default undefined. So default undefined has one binding for which the binding mode is set to one time. So in the source generator, let's go back to the file parser. No, it's not that one. It's the other one. So we go to the code generation. So we have the binding mode here. So binding mode is defined by xDefaultBindMode, and it's set to peak. So what would happen is that the bind mode is set afterwards, maybe. So when are we setting this? We do have a try set default bind mode. So where is that called? So we are building the child. That's when building child. So we're setting the bind mode. So what we can do is actually write something when the bind mode is actually set. So we're going to pass in something here that allows us to write something. So if I go to, that's the top level control. So there's the top level control that sets the binding here. The initializer body. We're going to pass in the writer. So the writer allows to write something to the output of the generator. So we're going to add that parameter, and we're going to write down when that set binding mode is actually done. So it may be done too early, which is definitely possible. So if there's a bind mode, we're going to write that down. So writer dot append line invariant, and we're going to set something like this, default bind mode, and set it to define mode. So in there, because we're changing the generator, we have to force the generation to happen again. So I'm just going to save the file without doing anything else and then rerun the test. What will happen is that the generator will kick in again and regenerate the file that we're looking at here. And we're going to take a look at what the generator changed at the top. So we're going to be searching for that line specifically and see where that one is set. So it has to be set before the generation of the additional file. So maybe I probably did something that is incorrect. So is it probably yes? So that happens. We get a writer again. So there were two locations for that one. And we're going to see what is generated again. No, still no indentation, so I'm probably passing in something that is invalid. Okay, so it has to be an I-indented string builder. So that's a string builder that allows us to have something that looks indented. That makes the generated code a little bit easier to read. Otherwise, it would be just all flat and then very difficult to understand. Okay, so the generation has probably happened already, but because it's still building, it's not showing it up. So we're still looking for current bind mode. We'll see when the build happens to finish. So another thing that you can do if you want to take a look at the generated file before it happens, you can just close the file and open it again. But in that case, if you close it, you have to. I wish there was a kind of a like in when you're in I think in Chrome, for instance, you can open the last one back. I don't think it's available in that. There's no open last close or something. So if you want to find the file here, you have to go here in the G folder, in the opt folder, and then try to find the file that was needed for the build. So it's the default bind mode, if I remember correctly. No, I don't remember which one that is. Binding default mode. Default mode. Data template. That's that one. Okay, so let's see if I can find my current mode. So the current mode is set to one way. And then we're parsing the content afterwards. So the binding mode template is defined here. So we're getting into this, but the default binding mode is set properly here. So that means that we're inside of that class. The default binding mode should be set properly, but it's not. It's set to one time here. So that means that we're missing out on something in between. Okay, so it's set properly here. But we're setting resources here with the binding, so we're generating this. That's interesting. So maybe it's been reset to something else. So we're going to be adding. Let's see if there's actually another one that does that kind of. So it's set to one way here, two way, one way, and nothing. Okay. So maybe it's being reset for some reason. Let's see. Return null, define mode null. Okay, I'm gonna probably show the current mode that's available. So let's show the current mode as part of the current bind mode. Well, that's resetting new bind mode and current. Current is already not defined that way, so we're going to be setting this one with peak. And if it still does not happen properly, we're going to have to go into another application to try to debug that one. Okay, so same thing, rebuilding a little bit. can close the file so we can open it up faster without having to wait for the end of the build. And we're going to try to find out the new, if it's there. Maybe it didn't do it. It hasn't done it already. One way. No, it's not there yet. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we have one time, one way. So it was set to one time, now it's become one way. It's become one way here, one way again, one time. So when we're at the root of that one, we're back to one time. So that would mean that this is being reset for some reason. Because it's that variable is set for one file, not multiple ones. So either it's being reset for some reason or popped maybe. It's not supposed to pop. Maybe, that could be because it's popped. That's probably why. That could be the case. So maybe it's set during this, but not during the resources here. So that is probably the reason. So defining resources that way, it's being set, then popped too early. So let's see when we're setting it here at the top. So the concept is that we're making scopes like that. And when you're getting out of the scope, then it gets popped out of the stack. And that's probably what's probably happening is that we're resetting it too early. So we're probably having the scope of the default bind mode to be just for what's supposed to be generated here, but it does not include the resources. Let's see if that's the case. So we have the top level control here, and we're doing it for the invariant. We're creating the imply block, the later properties and extended properties, but are we doing it for the rest? We're registering and applying for the resources as well. So we're doing it we're doing it for the resources. That's quite curious. So let's see again. So this one is defined top level. Let's add something that tells us when the stack is actually popped. So we're going to be displaying the current mode after the pop. So we're going to be seeing if it's actually that's happening. Okay, so if we're back to here, let's see if there's something else that we can see. So we're at the top here. So that would be for items panel template or data template. So we're doing something here that sets the default binding mode. There's nothing defined. So it's supposed to be using the current binding mode that exists. It's not supposed to be popping anything. That's odd. Okay, so it built. Did it build? Yes, it built. Okay, so let's see here. Do we finding popping? Popped. Okay. So we have here popped back to one time here. So it actually went all the way to all this. So this should be having it properly, but does not. So back to the build here. We can see the current default bind mode that was set here, and that one comes from the try set binding mode. So the peak for that mode at the top for the data template is set to something that is does not make sense. So it's like we're resetting it for some reason. Or that would mean that the generation is done afterwards, but that's not supposed to be the case, because the generation is supposed to happen right away. It's not the generation of data templates is not supposed to be lazy. It could have been happening, but inside of the file, if it were lazy, then it would have been written afterwards. So that's not something that makes sense. So if it still does not work, then we're gonna have to test it out inside of a smaller application, because inside of the Uno solution, it's too big. So I'm just gonna try to find one more time. Maybe I've missed something there. So in the generator, not that one. The current default binding mode is not supposed to be reset unless it's pushed out. It's default set to that one here, but that's it. There's nothing else. Okay, so it doesn't work properly, so we're gonna have to do a test in another application. So let's go do that. So, because otherwise, putting breakpoints is going to be very, very long. Okay, so I'm going to make a small data template stuff application that can be validating this. So let's search for Uno. I don't know if it's if I installed it in that solution, in that instance of Visual Studio. I think I did. Find out. Yes, it is. Okay, so let's call it default bind mode. Yeah, test. Okay, so what we need to do now is go to, let's say Skia, for instance, and take the version that we have here. So we're going to update it to a dev build, so we don't upgrade, we don't change the we don't override a stable build. So we're going to be updating just Uno. Okay, so now that we have updated this, then we can go and override that specific one. So let's say we're taking a look at that one, so a 3.8 dev 80. So we go back to Uno, and we're going to be changing the active solution. We go back to we're going to open the version of Uno that does support so that version of on the Team Explorer preview tool. So that that preview feature I'm not using at all. So I don't know if you guys are using it, but I'm definitely not using it. So I'm going to be disabling that. So it's the new preview experience for Git. I'm missing a few key features, so I generally disable that one so I can get back that specific button that's not available in the others. So I'm going to go to use that one, so NetsNetter 2, and we're going to be using the 3.8 dev and override the version. So when we're building Uno, it's going to override that version specifically to get to the newer version that we just built and that we can debug. So let's do this. So we go to open Uno in that specific version, so we can take the one with Skia. And then we're going to be building, we're going to just be building the generator, but we don't need to build the rest. It's not particularly useful. So we go to generators and then rebuild that one so it goes out. So we can see that when we're building that way, at the end of the build, we're going to get a mention that says that the output is going to go to one specific folder, which is the override folder. So when we're rebuilding the application on the other side, we're going to get some additional information. So that's that. That's the build, and then the generators that are built, and then we can see at the end the override that says the package cache has been overridden in the package cache, so in 380, and that the source generator is available there. So what we can do now is add a property that will force the generator to stop in the debugger when it starts running. So to do that, we can just go to, there's one property that we can set. I think it's set over here. I'll probably put it somewhere else. There are multiple entry points for that one. It's that one that I'm looking for. So it's defined in the documentation. So if you look for that one in the documentation, you're going to find it. But if we set that property to true, then the debugger will pause automatically when you're building the application. So I'm just going to be editing that file to add that property. And then when I'm building the application, I'm going to be getting when I need it. So it breaks there, and I can attach it to the Visual Studio instance there. See, so it runs there. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, so it's probably raising a bit too much. I'm going to be changing the default template sample here to add what I'm trying to get there. So I'll be adding just a small data template, so that's a bit annoying there. So what you can see here is that because it's the generation happens in the background, and every time you make a change, it actually tries to start the generation process. So it pops you multiple times when that happens. So it may be something that you can that you may want to change. So yeah, that is actually annoying. So I'm gonna change the mode for those to run only on the build, on demand on build, and not while the IDE is doing the generation for me on every change. So to do that, I'm just going to be using our custom generation tooling for now. So saying false here. So that one is going to be only running when we need it. Okay, so I'm going to be placing just one data template. That's going to be in page, the resources. Xkey, let's call it test. And we have an xDefaultBindMode. Which we're going to set to one way. And some text block with a text there to test. Let's call it test. We use another name. It's going to be my property, and the data type is going to be a small class, and I'm going to be calling my class, which is in local. So when I do this, it should be enough. Closing this. Let's create a small class here with only one property. My property, probably need to make that public a little bit. Okay, so if we regenerate, we're now going to be able to determine when there's an xbind if we're getting the right value or not. So let's rebuild this and see what happens. So we're going to validate that the data template is actually doing the right thing. So we're not attaching for now. So let's go see if the generation actually did the wrong thing, because that's what we're looking for. So in main page, we're looking for my property here. And we're going to take a look at the default mode, which is one time here, which is not the right one. So it should be something else. We can see here that we have one time defined here, but that's not supposed to happen. So let's change it. So if we rebuild, then we can go and put breakpoints at the right locations to understand what's happening. So it's key only. And now we're going to take a look at the different locations where we changed the default binding mode. So we're changing the default binding mode at different locations. So we're getting it at multiple times. So let's put a breakpoint in there first. And then at different other locations. So let's say when we're sending it to another value. So we're reading it once when we're inside the page. So the default bind mode is the default mode, which is one time. So that's fine. We're going to take a look at so when we're popping it. So we're in page. So that's the default. And then we're reading the default property that's being set. That one is being set to one way. And we're pushing it onto the stack. So we have two values, one way, one time. So this is the one that's taking precedence at the beginning. So now let's continue. Now we're trying set binding again, but this time it's for the data template. So we still have two. And the set mode is null. And then, so at that location, that the stack is the right one, but for some reason afterwards it gets incorrect. So now we still have two. It's still no binding mode defined, and we're inside of grid. We're inside of the text block itself, and there's a binding inside. Oh, we're popping something. Why are we popping something here? We're inside of the generic binding. Ha! I think I see what I mean. So there's definitely something that's lazy there. Because we should have been through the binding mode, and then we've lost the binding mode here. Okay, so we're out the binding mode, but the reason for this is that we're binding complex properties afterwards. And then for some reason, we're in build subclasses here. So that's why we're generating subclasses after the fact. So that's why the mode is not set properly for some reason. And then we're in the binding, so we're getting out. So okay, so that's why. So we're out. The bind mode is set afterwards, and we're generating the files afterwards. So that's why the bind mode is not kept properly. So in that context, so we're building extended property. We're building subclasses, and we're building subclasses here. Yeah. So we're in the current scope and subclasses. So there are some subclasses that we're generating. So that what happens there is that we're writing the class afterwards. So if we take a look at the file itself, that is generated. I don't know if it's going to be there. No, it's not there because we're not done. So that content is written way afterwards. So let's see here in the Xaml generation. So what happens is that we're generating all this. We're capturing the mode at that time, but we're just adding a reference to a class that's generated way after. And what that means is that the name scope defined from there is actually incorrect. So it's not the right one. It's lost. Not the name scope. The default bind mode is lost because we're getting into a different class, which with different location in the code for which the current binding mode has been disposed or has been popped out of the stack. So to fix this, what could we do? Multiple ways. We can actually capture the mode for the current classes. So let's say, because there's something that we may want to know. Let's say if you define a data template, let's say here, you have a content control, and you define a data template here, and you've changed the default binding mode at that location. What happens for that one? And my assumption would be that the binding mode changes again, uses the immediate parent, the immediate XML parent to set the value. So, and that would make sense because it would make it complicated to reason with. So let's do this for now. So when we go back here, there's a notion of subclasses here, and those classes are added one by one. So let's go to what we're doing here for the content owner. So when we're defining a subclass, we're registering it when we're doing it. So when we do build subclass, we know that we're doing it at that location, so we can capture we could probably capture the default bind mode at that location. So let's actually do that. So we're going to be capturing the bind mode at that location. So it's default bind mode. Capturing the default bind mode. And we're going to be setting it when we're doing this. So here there would be default bind mode and get current. Get default bind mode. Probably just do that a little bit to make it more readable. Okay, so we're capturing the bind mode in here. And then, hi Rizan, thanks for joining. I'm looking at adjusting the default bind mode feature in the XAML, so it behaves more properly. So I just found out what I need to fix, so I'll probably probably going to be able to fix it while you're still there. So now I'm going to go back to the location where that was used. So that was the subclasses here. So when we're doing that subclass, we're going to be pushing a new default mode at that location. So same thing, we're probably going to be doing a using here. I don't think we can use the new syntax. Well, we could probably use the syntax for the new fancy C# syntax, but that's it's the default. Try set default bind mode. But this time, instead of picking it up from the context, we have to provide one. So we're going to be providing the default value unless there's one specified. So for the context, there's actually none specified. So it would be default, let's call it ambient default bind mode. It's going to be null in that case with this. Oh, it's actually an older version of the sources. So I'm going to have to rebase because that file is actually completely nullable enabled now. So that's going to help. So I'm going to be rebasing that afterwards. Okay, so now we have this. So the default ambient mode. So we're getting the default value here if it's defined. And for the XAML definition object, unless there's one specified on it specifically, we're gonna pick up the ambient one. So let's do this, and so we do toString, and if it's not available, then we use the ambient mode instead. So if you go back here, so you can use the content owner, the writer. Oh, so it's actually the other way around. Writer. So if the content owner, which is most likely the data template, has an default bind mode set on it specifically, then we can use that one. Otherwise, we're going to use the one that's defined by the default bind mode that we captured originally. We want a XAML member definition. Do we have a member there? I'm not even sure. So that one is requesting a XAML object definition. So let's take the owner, probably just the owner there. So that would be the data template. We're going to take the owner of the data template. So we'll see what that does at that location. Okay, so that should be enough. And we're going to try to find, and we're just going to be displaying also the ambient mode so that we know what we're looking at. So ambient mode. So the ambient mode is set. And then we just need to rebuild all this in Skia. Well, just not rebuild, but just build that one. And then in the application, the default test application, that we can validate that the behavior is the right one. Okay, so let's go and rebuild the application and see if it fixes it. Okay, so let's skip the debugger for now and see if the generation did what it was supposed to be doing now. So what we're looking for is the property here. So my property, and the binding mode should be not one time, but it should be one way. And there it is. It's one way now. So one way. And if we look at the ambient mode is set to one way when we're starting to create the file we're starting to create the child class that defines the data template. So all the data templates are in their own classes for the scope. It's easier to work with and generate, but it has the inconvenience of being generated out of scope, out of the original scope. So we have to propagate some of the properties, and that one would be one of those properties to be defined. So now we can actually go and validate that the UI test, the unit test that was written at the beginning, is actually the right one and is doing what is supposed to be done. So we're going to switch back to net 461 here and open again the unit test solution filter. And we're going to see if the test now passes, and it should be passing. I really want that 64 bits version. I know, Martin, that you don't you're saying it's just an excuse to make things more bloaty, but yeah, I really want that version. I hope it's going to be out at build or something. So my test is here. If I rebuild this, it should go fast and go a lot farther. So the build is good. Takes a bit of time to start up. I don't know why. Probably just Roslyn or NuGet just doing their stuff in the code behind. Okay, so it's rebuilding everything else for now. So that file, that generator, it was actually created. The generator itself, it was created, I think, I don't remember exactly. I think it was probably 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. And there was not all the new fancy references validation, neural references validations that we have right now. And we had one more, or let's say one of the too many issues for null references that was happening in that file, that it made sense to just move everything over to nullable references. And now it actually found quite a few issues in that file. Just finding out that we were using Roslyn the wrong way, or assuming that some things may always return something and where there were not. So it fixed quite a few things. And my master is just probably too way back in time, so it doesn't have it. But yeah, if you have the occasion to do that and go to nullable references validation, yeah, do it. It's worth the investment in time, even if it takes a bit of gymnastics to add some additional attributes, some here and there, and to get that running properly. In the long run, it makes a lot of sense. I'm not regretting any of this. I wish the WinUI team was adding nullable annotations to WinUI, the WinUI WinMD definitions, but that's not the case for now. So it's a little bit difficult for us to actually add those annotations, and make it worthwhile for us to, and for you, as the users of Uno, to have nullable annotations at the right locations. But we don't want to be breaking locations that may not be. Okay, and it's green. Awesome. So an hour and a half to fix all this. So most of the time was spent doing a few fiddling with the build and understanding how to create that test, and then go to the other solution. But now we have an actual validation and tests that ensures that the binding mode is actually flowing through the data templates when defined in the file. So we're actually validating that that property is doing what it's supposed to be doing, and not the rest. Well, the rest was actually already doing what it was supposed to be doing, but that's validated as well. So that's going to be one more PR for the Uno platform, and one less bug. So that's it for today. Well, next week we're probably going to be looking at some additional other issues, maybe performance, maybe that one, the XUID that's missing, or that XUID issue that is there. But it's going to be a pretty similar process of creating the unit test and then validating that it actually does fail. This time it won't be a runtime issue. It's going to be a compile time issue, and then validating that everything works properly. So until then, have fun with Uno if you're doing some, and if you have any questions, drop us some questions on Discord, or on GitHub, or on Twitter, whichever, and give me a follow as well, on Twitch, and see you next week. Bye.